Hello, hello, hello. We are going to be discussing the global response to global warming in this conversation. And this is the video that relates to chapter 3 of Weird Weather. So we were talking last time about some of the things that have happened recently in terms of climate disasters. This one is quite subtle, but it's not a disaster in the sense that it's not a flood or a fire, but it speaks to the kind of cultural impact or the kind of more general impact that climate change is having in that Mount Fuji, one of the most famous icons of Japan, in the fall of November 2024, for the first time in history, it didn't have any snow on it in November. So this major shift into a whole new era in which something as important and symbolic and meaningful as Mount Fuji and the snow on it has been impacted by global warming and climate change. So, how long is it exactly that we have known about global warming, we humans? Um, Maybe this is not something that you know all that much about, and so you kind of assume that this is a new problem or something that we're only learning about, figuring out now. But the truth, in fact, is that scientists started to figure out that this would be a problem in the late 1800s, and they started then building up a whole repository of data and evidence to show that it in fact was already taking place by the 1960s. And by the 1970s, scientists were quite certain that this was no longer just a harebrained theory, but was in fact a reality. So it's been quite some time that we have already had scientific certainty about the question of climate change. And you know, we've been talking about science in this class and how you know whether or not you should trust a scientific study. And what we have talked about is that there should be a replication of results across various scientists, and that there should be a wider scientific consensus, and that if we want to really trust something, it should have withstood the test of time. So that theory about how things are in the world should have stood for 50 years, 75 years, 100 years. And in fact, this is true for climate change, for the theory of global warming, greenhouse gases, and their impact on the climate. We have not only a mounting body of evidence that is agreed to and supported by thousands of scientists, but it has also been around for a very long time now. And so this is one of the best established scientific theories that exists, and something that there is no question about at this point. So if you feel like this is not yet settled science, then you need to actually familiarize yourself with the science in order to find out that this is some of the best settled science that exists. So if we've known about this for such a long time, and it's such a disaster in the making, and it's something that will impact everyone on the planet and is already impacting so many people on the planet, if that's all true, then why haven't we done anything about it until now? What's kept us from acting? The answer to that is basically the fact that fossil fuels are wonderful. That something like coal, which you see here pictured coming out of the United Kingdom, England, Wales, Scotland in the 1920s, something like coal is capable of powering an entire society, both in terms of transportation and in terms of heat and in terms of electricity, which then was what enabled England and the rest of the United Kingdom to move to the forefront of developed nations in a way that made it one of the richest countries on earth. So the exciting developments around fossil fuels really built entire economies and entire nations. So that's basically why we haven't done anything about it, is because it enabled such wealth and such rapid development for the countries that had access to fossil fuels. That was very much the case for the United States, not just in coal, but particularly in oil. So the first commercial oil field was opened up in the late 1800s in Pennsylvania. And from that time forward, the United States really was a leader of the oil industry. And only later in the last century did other countries start to become major oil producers. But the United States has always been one of the biggest oil producers in the world. And we are, again, one of the biggest oil producers, sorry, the biggest oil producer in the world due to the innovative use of fracking to produce oil from sediments that formerly could not be used for oil production. So just as part of our own history here, as I mentioned in another video, Long Beach and Signal Hill have been a massive center for oil production. You can see this picture of all these oil rigs out across what is now the Los Cerritos neighborhood and into what would be the 405 and into Wrigley. These oil rigs are what made Long Beach really wealthy in addition to the port. So this is a major part of our own history. Our own production of fossil fuels has made our city what it is today and continues to be a major part of the economic and political landscape of Long Beach until today. So coal and oil facilitated really rapid transformations in transportation and in transport of goods and supplies. So you can see that from 1500 to 1840, the average speed at which things could travel was about 10 miles per hour, either on sailing ships or in horse-drawn carriages. And as we started to tap into fossil fuels, we were able to globalize the world through much faster movement between places, so that we were able to create forms of commerce and forms of trade and forms of supply chains that created what we now know today as globalization. So it's fossil fuels that essentially enabled the possibility for shrinking the planet by making it faster and faster and faster to move people and goods around the world, until today we now can move people and goods around the world at about 500 to 700 miles per hour, when it used to be 10 miles per hour a few centuries ago. So that contrast is all due to fossil fuels, which is too good to pass up if you think about it. This is one of the major reasons why we didn't do anything about the negative consequences of fossil fuels, because the positive consequences of fossil fuels were so tempting and so exciting. In addition to transport, fossil fuels enabled us to undergo what is called the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is a form of commercializing agriculture in ways that produced much higher yields of our crops, so that we had much more abundant food. And as I mentioned in an earlier video, that necessitated synthetic fertilizers. And synthetic fertilizers that give us this massive boom in crops are produced in part through the use of fossil fuels. They are partially petroleum-based products. So the Green Revolution that saw us produce so much more food than ever before was enabled in part by our use of fossil fuels. And that Green Revolution that was produced through massive boost in food production also saw a concomitant boost in human population. So we saw the number of humans and the lifespan of humans rapidly increase because the food that humans had access to was rapidly expanded through the use of, in part, fossil fuels for fertilizers. So you can see this is ending in 2010, but the number of population growth around the world has continued to boom until we now have 9 billion people around the world, 8 billion people, and we're headed towards 9 billion people in the near future. This is all enabled by the Green Revolution, which is enabled by, in part, fossil fuels. So why haven't we done anything about it? Well, we got globalization through really rapid transport around the world. We got electricity. We got our own individual transport in the form of cars, and we got mass public transport in the form of trains and planes and buses, and we got a bigger food supply that enabled a massive growth in human population as well. So what's not to like, right? On top of our transportation and our fertilizers, we also use fossil fuels for making steel and making concrete and making, as I've mentioned before, plastics and styrofoams and synthetic fabrics, which are a great deal of what we wear today. So not just our energy sources that get us around or that grow our plants, but also the very built environment around us and the things that we wear, the things that we use in our daily lives. Much of this is enabled by fossil fuels, specifically by coal in the case of steel, and oil in the case of plastics, and oil and gas in the case of concrete production. So out of this wonderful set of substances, we have produced these gorgeous cities around the world that are built out of steel and out of concrete, neither of which would be possible without fossil fuels. In the past, we're now finding new ways to be able to do that, but they necessitated fossil fuels, particularly coal, until recently. So the very cities that we live in are enabled by fossil fuels. So again, our built environment, our forms of transportation, our electricity, our very food, the things that we wear, all of this is out of fossil fuels. But as we know, of course, it's not just climate change that is the downside of fossil fuels. There's also massive air pollution. So these are pictures of London in the 1920s. We saw the pictures of the coal miners in the 1920s in the UK, and all of that coal that was being burned for heat and also for electricity around the country, it produced the kind of smoke that meant that London became known as the London fog, and the Great Smoke became ways in which people referred to London because it was so insanely polluted for such a long time. And as you probably know, air pollution is not just ugly. It causes asthma, and it causes forms of cancer. It causes early onset dementia and cognitive decline. It facilitates worse depression. It has all sorts of consequences for our everyday health, and it shortens the lifespan significantly. So here in Long Beach, the neighborhoods that are along the 710 corridor are called Asthma Alley, or sometimes they're called the Diesel Death Corridor, because all of those trucks that are coming out of the port and into the port, pumping out diesel smoke, they end up causing the people who are near them in Western Long Beach to have not only high rates of asthma, but all sorts of other health complications that mean that people in Western Long Beach have 5 to 10 years shorter life expectancy than people in Eastern Long Beach, just the other side of the same city. So air quality matters a lot to people's health and people's longevity, their ability to live well and live long. And you can see that London really got their air pollution under control after the 1950s, after the war, and they look nothing like they did back in the 1920s. Here is LA in the 1980s, when our own air pollution, as a consequence of largely cars and trucks, but also as a consequence of ships coming into the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach pumping out diesel fuel, sitting in the basin that we live in, and causing an inversion that we've become really familiar with here. And of course, we have taken massive measures in Los Angeles, just like London did in the past, to get a handle on our air pollution, start trapping more of that in the cars themselves, so that we are filtering out that pollution rather than letting the cars and trucks and the boats, there we go, the ships coming into the ports, rather than letting them pump that out, capturing that at the source of burning those fossil fuels so that they don't fill our air. So our air is better than it was back in the 80s in Los Angeles and Long Beach, but it's still much worse than it is in the rest of the nation. Long Beach has some of the worst air in the nation as a whole because of fossil fuels. But our air quality is nowhere near as bad as what things are looking like today in big cities in China and in New Delhi. So the kind of economic development that fossil fuels enabled for the United Kingdom, for the United States, are now taking place in countries like China and India. And as a consequence, just like we have been heavily dependent on coal, and we have allowed a lot of emissions from coal and a lot of emissions from transportation in the past in our countries, so too China and India are now undergoing their own rapid development that is highly dependent on fossil fuels, and they are seeing a massive uptick in terrible air quality. Particularly, China is starting to do some things to get theirs under control, but India right now is a major hotspot for huge air pollution. And you can think about the production that's going on in China, the factories that create a lot of the goods that we consume here in the United States. Or you can think about the industry that's going on in India, a lot of the IT, for example, that supports much of our IT industry here in the United States, especially in California. You can think of that as a form of outsourcing air pollution, because as we globalize and we link our economies together, and we produce in China what we used to produce here in the United States for our local consumption, we also outsource the pollution that we would have had in this country to China or to India or to related countries. So the globalization that has enabled our levels of consumption and our rapid transit, and our rapid sharing of innovations across the world have also meant that we are sharing the production of air pollution, and hopefully countries like India and China will begin to get a rein on air pollution and the production of the things that cause shorter life expectancy for their citizens, as we have begun to do, although we've not completed that here in the United States. So as developing countries seek to become big economies and seek to create wealth for their citizens the way that countries like the United States and the UK have done in the past, they face a double bind because it's, again, not just air quality that is the problem with fossil fuel reliance. It's more importantly the problem of global warming and climate change. So at the very moment that these countries are wanting to really increase their use of energy in order to grow their economies, they're also faced with the fact that if they do use these fossil fuels in a major way, they are likely to be more impacted by climate change than the countries that are largely responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that have taken place in the past. That is just a facet of the way in which climate change is impacting countries differently. So wealthier countries have more resilience and better ability to weather the storms of climate change, and poorer countries do not. Also, heat and climate change are worse in developing countries than they are in wealthier countries across Europe and North America. Although everyone is being impacted by climate change, poorer countries are being impacted worse than wealthy countries. So they face this double bind where they want to develop, they want to get wealthier, they want to build their cities and build their economies. But at the same time, if they do that with fossil fuels, then they are basically shooting themselves in the foot because they are experiencing the problems of climate change worse than anyone else. So cheap energy makes economies possible. At the same time, it makes climate change and climate disasters an absolute certainty. So they're faced with this sense of not knowing how to go forward. Well, China, faced with this problem of deciding what to do in the face of climate change, has doubled down on coal. They've essentially said, nope, we are going to prioritize our economy and not prioritize climate change. And so they have built a huge number of coal-fired power plants. They are also putting in other kinds of energy sources, but they really have not stepped back from coal, which is in part why they're so polluted, but also their economy is continuing to develop rapidly. And as you can see, India is another major country that's using coal at a rapid rate. But interestingly, the United States continues to use a lot of coal as well, despite the fact that at this point, energy from solar and wind and geothermal renewable sources is actually cheaper than it is from coal and from nuclear sources as well. So although it is cheaper to grow your economy with fossil fuels, it is possible to grow your economy without fossil fuels. Here is a graph illustrating a bunch of countries, many of them in Europe, but some of them in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, that have successfully grown their economies while at the same time reducing their CO2 emissions. So it's possible to not have to choose. It's just that it's more expensive to not rely solely on fossil fuels, or to rely on fossil fuels in ways that don't pump out as many carbon emissions. So you can see Romania in particular and Azerbaijan have been very successful at rapidly growing their economies without increasing their CO2 emissions. Okay, so we've known about climate change, as I mentioned earlier, since the 1800s, and we have known about it in a really serious way since the 1960s, and even more so since the 1970s. So what have we done about it so far as a globe, since we've been quite certain about this problem and both the theory and having the evidence to prove the theory for quite some time? Well, the United Nations founded what's called the International Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is a mistake on the slide. Apologies for that. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988. And the IPCC is the premier organization in the world for overseeing climate science. It's brought together thousands of climate scientists for decades to share their findings and to come up with policy in relationship to the scientific evidence that's out there. They've been very conservative, the IPCC, in giving recommendations to the United Nations over the years. But in recent years, because the situation with climate change has gotten so bad, the IPCC has been very loud and very worried about the state of affairs. But they've been in operation since 1988, and they're considered the highest body of experts in the world on this topic. So using the advice of the scientists from the IPCC, in 1992, the United Nations put together a framework convention on climate change, and they created a series of summits, a yearly summit on climate change that moves from place to place. And it was in that year, in 1992, that they agreed among the various nations who were part of this framework on climate change to keep things on the planet below 2 degrees Celsius. So it was in that year, in 1992, a very long time ago, before the majority of you were born, that the United Nations set that goal of 2 degrees Celsius. And as I've mentioned, we are very rapidly approaching that 2 degrees Celsius already. And as we get closer to it, we're already seeing a great many more climate disasters on a daily basis around the world and on a regular basis here in the United States. Now, in 2015, the United Nations put together what is called the Paris Agreement, which was basically a treaty that countries signed to agree to keep themselves within certain targets for carbon emissions to enable the country as a whole, the world as a whole, to stay within 2 degrees Celsius of climate change, of global warming. I'm doing a great job of mushing up my words today. So this was first, the Paris Agreement that you probably heard about lots of times, it was first agreed to in 2015. And it was initially signed by our country, by President Barack Obama. And it was to go into effect, but there are a few problems with the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement has been signed by 195 countries. And since that time, several of them have made massive improvements in their emissions of greenhouse gases. And as a whole, the European Union has made quite a bit of progress toward a 2030 climate target of reducing their overall emissions for all of the European Union. But Costa Rica, Norway, and New Zealand have really been standouts in reducing their carbon emissions and moving towards what's called carbon neutrality, where a country is not emitting any more carbon than it is sucking out of the atmosphere. So zeroing out the overall contribution of carbon to the atmosphere. So Sweden's going to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, and Costa Rica is on track to do that by 2050, and Norway by 2030, and New Zealand by 2030. So some countries are really very far ahead of us and have made great strides, which is pretty exciting, and they're really the leaders in addressing climate change around the world. But as I mentioned, this agreement that 195 countries signed onto in 2015 has major problems. The first is that everyone's signature, every country's signature, was basically just a promise without any means of enforcement. So this would all be countries doing this of their own free will, but there's no way of holding them to what they promised to do. Another major problem with the Paris Agreement is that the United States pulled out of the Paris Agreement in 2016. And even though the United States re-entered it in 2021, it was again we again pulled out in 2025, so that the rest of the world doesn't have confidence that the United States is in fact on board with the Paris Agreement, which really undermines the usefulness of the Paris Agreement, because if the major player in carbon emissions and methane emissions in the world, which is the United States, is not willing to sign on, then why should all those countries who did sign on actually follow through with what they said they would do? So this is another major problem that the world as a whole is facing, is that the United States is not willing to do what it said in terms of the climate promises it made for the Paris Agreement. Another problem with the Paris Agreement is that the carbon caps that it assigns to various countries don't in fact reflect the historical realities of who it was that created the climate crisis in the first place. So let's talk about that on the other slides. There are some countries that are far more responsible for emissions from carbon and methane than any others. 2/3 of global emissions really come from just a handful of countries. Today, those countries are China, the United States, the European Union as a whole, and India and Russia. Those are the really big players in terms of global emissions. So 195 countries signed on saying that they would start to do what's necessary to reduce their carbon emissions, but they really weren't the ones who are, they're not the ones who are the big players in the first place. And as I'll show you on the slide in a minute, they're not the ones historically that pumped that much carbon into the atmosphere and got us to where we are today. So although many countries have agreed to change things, it feels a little unfair to them because they're signing on to something that doesn't acknowledge and doesn't address and doesn't distribute the responsibility in relationship to who truly is the big players in terms of emissions today and who has been the big players historically. So here's another visualization of who's responsible for the carbon emissions. Note that while China is massively responsible for carbon emissions, if you spread out those carbon emissions over their population as a whole, they are not as responsible as many countries for carbon emissions. So on a person by person basis, because China has such a massive population, they have lower carbon emissions than many other countries, including the United States. But not just the United States, also Canada, much of the Middle East, Australia. So Australia, New Zealand, US, Saudi Arabia all have per person much higher carbon emissions than China does, even though en masse, all the people in China together as a country have higher emissions today than most other countries. So in terms of historically, if we look back over who has been really responsible for pumping out the carbon emissions that are now giving us the climate change that we're experiencing today, if you look starting back in the 1800s, the country that became responsible for carbon emissions first, just as I showed you at the beginning of the slides here, was the United Kingdom. They started mining coal in a massive way, using it to power factories and using it to power steam engines and trains and ships in a really big way. They were the first country to do that. And so they have been historically very responsible for the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere, but they were rapidly surpassed by the United States in the 1900s. And as you can see from this slide, the United States overall has been far more responsible than any nearest country for the total carbon emissions that are now already in our atmosphere and that are creating the climate change that is devastating so much of the planet. So historically, United Kingdom had been, but United Kingdom is now below what China is producing, and it's about on par with the rest of the world. But if you look overall at what the United Kingdom and the United States are responsible for, it's way more than what China and India are responsible for. So yes, today China and India are pumping out massive amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, and we cannot do that because we just don't have the capacity in the atmosphere to take any more carbon emissions. But those carbon emissions that are already up there are mostly produced by two countries, the United States and the United Kingdom. So the United States and the United Kingdom need to take responsibility for the fact that overall climate change that we're already experiencing is our doing as opposed to that of the world as a whole. One way to visualize this is to look at this really interesting contrast in terms of consumer relationship to emissions, and note that the United States consumes so much that even an unhoused person in the United States, their consumption is significantly more detrimental to the overall climate, the planet as a whole, than the average person who's housed around the world. So the United States, our consumption levels, the way in which we've built our houses, our cities, our stores, and the way in which we produce and consume goods, but particularly how we heat and cool our spaces and the way that we get around in cars, all of that has meant that we as a whole are consuming far more than the average person in the rest of the world in ways that has massive impacts on our climate. Okay, so overall, things that I would like you to know from this chapter is that we have been aware of this problem and having the opportunity to address it for well over a century. So this is not news, and we should have been on it before now. But the reason why we were not on it is because it was so tempting to live the fossil fuel utopia that enabled us to not only produce electricity, power our factories, power our forms of transportation, but build cities with steel and concrete, and build all of the synthetics that are around us in the forms of plastics and styrofoams and synthetic fabrics. So, and the electricity to power all of these machines. So all of this was enabled by fossil fuels, and we in a sense, we're addicted to fossil fuels. We don't want to check ourselves and stop what has become so, we've become so dependent on. Some countries are far more responsible for the problem of climate change than others. And as I just showed you in that graph, the carbon emissions in particular that are out there in the world are primarily the responsibility of the United States and the United Kingdom. England, Wales, and Scotland, and Northern Ireland. There are today countries where per capita, per person, there's far more responsibility. So this is the Middle East, and especially Saudi Arabia. This is Australia. This is New Zealand. This is Canada. These are all places where per person, there's a great deal of responsibility to scale back the amount of carbon emissions. And as poor countries develop and attempt to grow their economies, they need to be offered ways to do that that don't hamper their growth and at the same time don't jeopardize the climate crisis that we're all facing. So the countries that are largely responsible for climate change need to offer poorer countries help in developing in ways that will protect all of us while still allowing poorer countries to move forward and not force them to forego the development that fossil fuel allowed our wealthy countries. So it is possible to do that. Countries are doing it. We need to coordinate between our countries in order for wealthy countries to help poorer countries do that in a sensible, sustainable way that will not jeopardize us. And the Paris Agreement does not accomplish that. It doesn't apportion responsibility in the way that it needs to. There's been a little bit of agreement that wealthier countries will start to fund poorer countries for reducing their carbon emissions and their methane emissions. There's been a little bit of that, but it's nowhere near sufficient to be able to enable those countries to grow at the rate that they need to grow at. So we have not done enough on climate change. What we have done is already crumbling because the Paris Agreement is basically defunct without the United States being a active part in it. And so the present state of response to the global climate crisis is very worrying. And that's where we are today.